Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and thank you so much for joining us one more time in the Red Best Lives. We're at the Red Cross Red Crescent International Conference. And today we will be having a really interesting conversation on how national societies in the Caribbean prepare communities and work with communities for future strategies for hurricane resilience. Today we have the great pleasure to talk with Samantha Dixon, President of the Grenada Red Cross. Welcome, Samantha. And we also have Alessandra Sandy-Chung from the Jamaican Red Cross. And to kick off this conversation, I was recently revisiting a press release that the IFRC issued a couple of months ago when Hurricane Beryl was approaching the Caribbean. And I was reading, and I have it here, that it was the earliest hurricane in history that came early enough with a category as high as Category 5. And I know that your national societies were very engaged, preparing but also responding to when the Hurricane Beryl landed in each of your countries. So with this kind of like frame of what have national societies in the Caribbean been engaging, but also working with communities and with volunteers and staff, I would like to go first with Jamaica and ask the first question. What has been the impact of implementing early warning systems to ensure that people and populations and communities that are vulnerable to the impacts of disasters such as hurricanes are adequately prepared for hurricane impacts?
Okay. Traditionally in Jamaica, most of our persons in Jamaica rely on mainstream media to provide them with information regarding early warning systems, and that is really television, radio, or newspaper. Currently, persons are using social media, but you know that sometimes the information that is given on social media is sometimes inaccurate. But what we do, we rely on the Meteorological Service of Jamaica to provide us with the information. Also, because we are also a part of the disaster management network in terms of ODPEM, so we are given information through ODPEM, updated information, and so that is what we do. Also, one of the things is that we actually have what are called community disaster management committees, and so in that situation, those CDRMT, which also have received training from the Jamaica Red Cross, but they are also involved with ODPEM and the municipal corporations, which is what our local government entities are now called. They used to be called parish councils before, but now. And so because of that situation and because that entity, which there is trust between them and the community, and so when they use their WhatsApp group to issue information or to disseminate information to other persons, they will listen to that kind of information. One of the other things is that they also know where the persons are, because this is localized, so they know the vulnerable persons, like in terms of persons who are elderly, persons with disabilities and children. And what we found in this particular situation, and I'll speak about an example of an area called Rocky Point in Clarendon, the persons were able to get mobilized and they evacuated the area even before the hurricane came about, because they trusted those persons. And so what it does is to minimize the dangers that we would have had.
100%. So I hear that involving communities, but also relying on the power and the trust that communities have on
Right,
local
with
actors
each
is
other.
essential.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And talking about local actors, I'm going to turn to you, Samantha, because I would like to understand what has been the role and the added value when we talk about volunteers, not only for preparedness and early action, but also during the recovery period after disaster has hit the ground. So can you share the microphone with Samantha?
Yes,
Go ahead.
certainly. So thank you for the opportunity to participate in this forum. Always grateful for the education and for sharing the great role that our volunteers play. You mentioned Hurricane Beryl, which was just a couple months ago. It impacted Grenada, or one of our tri-island, got 90% damage. And our volunteers were even out in the field as soon as, and a little before the all clear was given, because we were operating from our main headquarters, which was not affected, thankfully. And so we always say that our volunteers are our greatest assets, and we mean that from the bottom of our hearts, because without them, we won't be able to reach anyone on time, as we usually do. So in terms of, I would say, response and recovery, so preparedness, we've talked about how early warning systems affect the work that we do. But in terms of response, even being casualties themselves or affected by the very event, they are still somehow the ones that are out there first doing the PSS, doing the cleanup, doing the assessments, sending information back to us, back the management, so that we know how and when and why we are deploying resources. Ms. Chong referred to collaborating with the national services in Grenada. Similarly, we call ours NADMA. And then it's the same sort of principles. The volunteers with the CDRT training, with the first aid training, psychosocial support, whether it's first aid, they put those skills into action, and somehow they're the magicians that make this work on our behalf.
And I assume that it must be difficult. I know this was an unscripted question, but it would also be difficult. I can imagine if volunteers are from the same communities and staff members are also from the same communities that are being affected. In your experience, how does that play a role also in the response when disasters strike?
Certainly it does, and I'll go back 20 years, because 20 years ago we had a Category 3 Hurricane Ivan that destroyed the main island 90%. And we didn't know, those of us who were at management at the time, had no prior experience to hurricane. We had it on theory, we had done all the trainings, we thought we were ready, but when it actually happened and we saw what happened, it was this new thing. And so, of course, we had the external help of IFRC, the participating national societies who came in to help. And we started to realize that things were happening that were unusual. And then when we investigated, the volunteers were becoming restless. They were doing the, let's say, taking things while we were busy treating the entire population. We were not thinking about our volunteers, so we were busy serving. And then we were exposed to the methodology of psychosocial support. It was the first time for me, even 20 years ago. And we took it seriously, and now it's integrated into our programs. And our volunteers are people too, and they go through the assessments. One thing I'd like to put on record, because a lot of times people think that maybe volunteers are treated with preference, and that's not the case. We do it as we do with everybody else. They go through assessments, but we have a specific program for debriefing and making sure volunteers are all right to face the recovery and the response. However, we also educate people that when you come to volunteer, it is not that you come in with a preferential thing in mind, because sometimes people come with false expectations as well. So, you have to be open, you have to be transparent, and we're attracting really professional volunteers, well-trained volunteers who come and want to give from the heart.
Those are kind of like inspiring stories to hear, because I'm pretty sure that it's not easy to respond when you see that your community and even your family can be impacted. But I want to go back a little bit, because with increasing temperatures, and we are talking about also how the climate crisis is impacting how frequent disasters happen. There's one topic that is called nature-based solutions. And I would like to go back with Sandy, because I know that Jamaica is one of the countries that are championing these types of,
Right.
of
Yes,
activities.
we
So
are.
first of all, for all of us that we are not too much into climate smart solutions and these sort of things, can you, in a brief note, tell us what are nature-based solutions and how
Right.
can that help us to build hurricane resilience?
Well, in Jamaica, we are using nature-based solutions to assist us with managing climate change, and that is basically utilizing nature in terms of, for example, mangroves. What we find is that if you utilize mangroves, they not only assist with mitigating the amount of flooding, because the roots of the mangroves also act as a nursery for fish, and so you're also at the same time replenishing because what we have found is that if you deforest an area, so what we are doing actually is we are into a situation where we are going to be replanting mangroves in a fishing village called Old Arbor Bay, which is in St. Catherine, and that is like the largest fishing village that we have in our island. So and we also had a situation where we did some preparatory work with them under the Resilient Islands project, right? Because mangroves, believe me, there is apart from with that situation, there's a situation where there were mangroves that were planted in another area of Jamaica where we have what is called the largest luminous lake in the world. And when they cut down the mangroves, the lake was no longer luminous. And so what the National Environment and Planning Agency had to do was to replant the mangroves, and then it really assisted because also in terms of your nature-based solution watersheds, if you denude your watershed of all those trees and things, then you end up having more landslides and erosion taking place. And so what one has to do is to ensure that, and so we at Jamaica Red Cross are actually engaged with the forestry department with planting some trees in various different areas at this point in time, because that is one of the climate smart nature-based solutions that's going to help us, because you want to mitigate erosion, you want to mitigate flooding, because that seems to take place and also in terms of damage to roadways, because when you plant all of these things that we have been taken for granted, it does help because the roots of the plants help to keep the ground
Correct.
firm.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And you mentioned the Resilient Islands project, and
yes.
I always thought how interesting it is to go back to nature as a solution to the impacts that we're seeing with changing climate.
Yes.
And it's interesting that we're talking about nature, but I would like to ask you, Samantha, about what role does technology also plays when we're talking about increasing disasters and more frequent disasters because of the impacts of the climate crisis. How can technology help us predict but also anticipate when a hurricane or a disaster strikes? In Grenada's experience, how has that helped you?
Yes, so thank you for an important question. And as we use information from technological advancements for keeping people safe in this scenario, early warning systems, for example, and the information that we get from the developed technology tend to be a little more accurate. And so, like Ms. Chung mentioned before, we depend on the government and the technical persons to give us that information The faster we get it, the faster we are able to disseminate it. That's one. Let's say non-crisis time. When we get the information, we can plan around it to prevent. Our messages can be tailored around the information that we get. We can scenario plan and look at different scenarios for the same event. So we can plan for a category 1, we can plan for a category 5, we can plan for a tsunami that's 2 feet high or 10 feet high or 20 feet high. What kind of population in terms of size would have to evacuate based on the data that we have. And as technology improves, so is the ability to be able to plan as the technocrats on one side, and it also helps with the kind of messaging and the kind of preparedness that we have to give the communities that we serve.
And I think that's really important to understand with the advancement of technology, how can that actually help us mitigate and anticipate the impact that such disasters can have. And, on a yearly basis, we hear, it's starting hurricane season in the Caribbean, and the role of technology, I guess that is very relevant in order, like you were saying, to train communities, to build capacity, but also to plan according to the different categories that we have when we're talking about hurricanes.
What it also does, it allows you to do simulation exercises with persons so that, you actually go through the steps as if it were actually happening, so that when it does happen, they are more prepared to deal with this situation when it comes.
Exactly.
Because we do simulations even for things like earthquakes. You do a simulation and you go through all the steps, and so when the earthquake comes, people know that you are to drop and do all of the things, go under the table and all of that sort of thing, as well as in terms of the persons, those who are supposed to be first responders are well aware.
And trained.
Yeah,
exactly. Well, I guess that we could continue talking about preparedness and early action and so on. But before wrapping up, I would like to ask if, it's not every day that we have a chance of sitting down with two national societies, National Red Cross and Red Cross societies from the Caribbean. Anything that you would like to share with our audience that is watching us today when we talk about early action preparedness and how the role of the Red Cross is essential to keep people safe, but also to assist them when disasters strike. Anything that you would like to highlight for our audience today? Maybe we can start with Samantha.
Sure. Thank you again. You're asking all the million-dollar questions, as we say. But with every scenario, it begins with me as an individual. And so as an individual, I have to secure my family. And then when I secure my family, then I'll be able to give others of myself. And so as an individual, you have things from as easy as having your disaster kit, empowering yourselves, knowing where your nearest emergency shelters are, for example, knowing and having a plan. Then you have the issue of risk transfer, insurance, because we have seen, for example, out of Beryl, the CCRIF, for example, is an insurance that pays when disasters trigger certain impacts. And Grenada received the largest payout of that insurance so far in its history of some 34 point whatever million US dollars to help with the response and recovery. So risk transfer to some instance can also help. And then, of course, we normally say, well, volunteer with your Red Cross, get trained in the methodologies that we offer, and pay attention to the authentic sources of information. Ms. Chong mentioned the impact of what social media can and cannot do, so both good and bad, but at the same time know how you're empowering yourself, your family, your community, and we mentioned the CDRTs. So it goes from the individual to the community, to the country, to the region, to the world.
Right.
And so at every level you have various mechanisms that can be triggered during and post any emergency. Of course, it depends on the event, the level of impact, the scope of what has happened, but we always have these services and these networks that we can rely on in that time of need.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And for you,
And
Sandy?
I think, like Samantha says, preparedness is key. And so we all have to ensure that we are prepared when these things are happening, and that our people are trained properly so that they know how to respond. And we also need to ensure that the lines of communications are open. One of the things we found that in terms of communications, when we had a minor earthquake, one of the things we found out is that and I'm talking about the telephone systems, right? Both telephone systems were not functioning the way they should. And so it means that you have to look at another methodology of communicating. And so, there are other methodologies, because I know that when they had these repeater stations with those radios, that seemed to have worked much better than what happened with the phone systems recently for us. So we were able to get through to most of our persons during Beryl in terms of even when the phones went for a little while, we were able, because although one network will work in some places and didn't work in others, and so because we had telephones from both networks, we were able to communicate with our people. And so I think one has to ensure that we are always prepared. Our volunteers are also ready. They know that they have to take care of themselves first. And like Samantha was saying about psychosocial support, we in Jamaica understand that our volunteers need that psychosocial support, not just our other vulnerable persons, but because if they don't, then sometimes they fall apart if they don't get that. And we are aware. And so we are ensuring that our volunteers do get, because I don't know if you're aware, but Jamaica has a very strong psychosocial support program staffed by trained psychologists and psychiatrists, and apart from that, we have been doing training. We have offered psychosocial support to the Bahamas when Hurricane Dorian. We have offered it to Dominica. We have also offered it to Chile. And so it's one of our big areas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandy. I think this is the power of a global network in 191 national societies around the world, the information sharing and creating such spaces where we can hear from your experiences what has worked, what hasn't worked, that we also learn from that. So I appreciate so much your time and spending, a couple of minutes with us to understand better how are you creating impact and building more resilient communities when we're talking about disasters and hurricanes. And for you, I hope that you learned as much as I did. Thank you again, Samantha Dixon.
We want to thank you.
Oh yes, we want to together. We want to say thank you.
Thank you
for the
also.
opportunity.
Our pleasure. So again, Samantha Dixon from Grenada Red Cross and Alessandra Chung from Jamaican Red Cross. It was a pleasure. Thank you.